Welcome, everybody. This is Sal Silvester from 512 Solutions. Thank you so much for joining me today for this very important leadership topic. Today's masterclass is focused on productive conflict and moving beyond a culture of nice. And it's part of our on-purpose leadership philosophy, where we believe that to be successful in today's complex and volatile world and workplace, leaders have to be intentional, always evolving, connected to people around them and to their surroundings, and thinking about how to make a bigger contribution. And so this is a really important topic. As all of you know, conflict is inevitable in any relationship or in any workplace. And so the key is, how do we make it productive so that we get some great innovative and creative outcomes? So in today's session, we're going to really focus on how do we move beyond a culture of nice, because part of what we notice when we're working with organizations is oftentimes there's a strong avoidance of conflict. We call that a culture of nice. So my intent is to give you a quick experience today with some practical tools. This is a 30-minute session that hopefully you can implement immediately and will have a high impact on your people and organizations. So we're going to talk about conflict in today's workplace. We're going to talk about a case study of an organization that we did work with that really embraced the concept of a culture of nice. And then we're going to talk about how do you shift from that culture of nice to a culture of candor. And finally, we'll share some productive conflict resources that you may have already seen on our website. So the foundational question that we have for you today is, how do you move beyond a culture of nice to a culture of candor? And how do you do that in a way that drives results and also builds relationships? You'll notice this dichotomy. We often talk about results and relationships. So how do we move to a culture of nice that does both? Gets us the business results, organizational results that we want and need, but also does it in a way that builds commitment. So as you think about conflict, what's one of the first words that comes to mind for you? Take a moment and jot that down inside the chat box. Let's see what comes up. So what comes to mind when you think about conflict, especially conflict in the workplace? And part of what we want to do today is convey that conflict is a really important part of any team dynamic. In fact, it's so important to any relationship that when you don't have it, ultimately we believe that relationship or that organization will fail. It's that important, but we have to be able to do it in a way that is productive. So how much time do you think you spend on conflict? Well, we've got some really interesting data about the amount of time that people spend on blame and gossip and disrespect and complaining, whatever conflict looks like in your organization. Sometimes it's caving in or passivity or even withdrawal. And the typical manager, according to the Washington Business Journal, spends about 25 to 40% of his or her time on conflict. That's a lot of time. That's a lot of time spent dealing with gossip and protecting turf and retaliating or recruiting people to one side or other. And really, more importantly, it's a lot of time not spent on your core business purpose, not spent on answering customer questions or filling orders or fill in the blank, right? Doing the things to engage people and employees in a really productive way. And in the US, a conservative estimate of the cost of this, and if we think about people spending 3 hours of their week at an average salary, hourly salary of $18 an hour, it's $359 billion spent on workplace conflict. It's a lot of money. It's a lot of time. It's a lot of energy. And according to the authors of Controlling the Cost of Conflict, it might be one of the largest reducible costs in business. So it's probably worth spending some time in this area. And for organizations that don't, it's going to be very hard to keep up with others that are more agile and more innovative and more disruptive in the workplace. And we can always make a direct connection between conflict avoidance and ineffective business results. Conflict and avoidance and ineffective business results can always be linked. There's an interesting article, some of you may have seen it just this morning in the Wall Street Journal, about how the concept of radical candor is so key to many very innovative businesses, Netflix being one of them, Bridgewater Associates being another. So this is one way that we can create healthier workplaces if we deal with conflict productively. And if we start to embrace the idea of candor and moving away from an environment of a culture of nice. So as we talk about this important topic today, I want to make a distinction. I want to make a distinction between conflict resolution and productive conflict, because part of what we're focused on today is not conflict resolution, but our session today is really about productive conflict. And conflict resolution tends to be a process that doesn't really consider individuals. It's a process that is used to resolve conflict without confrontation. And with conflict resolution, usually each side generally has to compromise or make concessions that result in equally dissatisfying outcomes. Productive conflict, on the other hand, is different. Productive conflict starts to take a look at how do you respond to conflict personally? What's the connection between your thoughts and your feelings and the behaviors that show up? And when we look at that as a whole, what are the collective dynamics of our team in conflict? So part of this is we've got to move beyond just skill development or a 4-step process to resolving a situation. And we have to start building the capacity of our people so that as an organization, we can be more agile and more nimble and respond and be more adept to change in this chaotic and complex work environment that we live in today. So we're talking about productive conflict today, not conflict resolution. And our intent is to be able to empower employees to have productive conflict so that we can create better business outcomes. And as a first step in doing that, we do really have to look at our individual responses in conflict. And that's not the focus of today's session, but I'm going to take a second or two to just sort of tie into the first masterclass that we ran earlier this summer, which was really focused on individual responses in conflict. Today, we're going to mostly focus on teams and organizations. And some of you may know Ben and Daryl. They're from 2 of my leadership books, Ignite, the 4 Essential Rules for Emerging Leaders, and Unite, the 4 Mindset Shifts for Senior Leaders. And Daryl on the left is your classic, friendly, cooperative, agreeable leader, wants to get along with others, wants to be liked by others, and he tends to avoid conflict. And as a result, he creates an environment of artificial harmony. Ben, on the other hand, on the right side, is your bold, aggressive, results-oriented leader, and it's not uncommon for him to leave others behind in the workplace. Oftentimes, he's impatient. Sometimes in conflict, he's intimidating, and he tends to create an environment of compliance instead of commitment. And it's not uncommon for him to create a culture of fear. So as we consider these 2 individual leaders, part of the solution that we presented in our first masterclass, which is recorded and accessible to you at no cost, is that we really have to understand our individual tendencies in conflict. How do you show up? What are your typical responses in conflict? And how can you engage more effectively with others? And so part of what we explored in that first masterclass was, what are the factors that influence how you respond in conflict? One of them, or a few of them, being your upbringing. Where you grew up, the type of family you grew up in, what was rewarded and criticized in your household. So I grew up in an Italian Catholic heritage family on the East Coast, just outside of Boston and Connecticut. And so the way that we dealt with conflict was pretty passive aggressively. So we looked at sort of the nurture of what goes into conflict. And then part of what we also looked at was a model called DISC. Many of you are familiar with it. Some of you on this webinar or this masterclass have been in some of my programs related to DISC. And we looked at this lens that lays out different personality styles, four main styles of personality. And ultimately, we tend to use one or two of those styles more than others, but we're really a mix of all those styles. But in conflict, these different styles respond differently. The dominant style tends to focus on logic and victory. They tend to be very direct and sometimes forceful in conflict. The influence style tends to focus on expression and feelings in conflict. You'll see some more outgoing, sometimes enthusiastic and optimistic behavior, and that emotional component can come out in conflict. When we look at the steadiness style, it's not uncommon to see even-tempered, accommodating people, patient, loyal, good listeners, sort of the glue that holds a team together. And in conflict, sometimes that style will let things simmer under the surface, and can be an avoidance factor as they're focused on feelings and consensus. And the conscientiousness style, more analytical and reserved and logic-focused. In conflict, that style can initially withdraw, but then they focus on logic and on justice. So these are just a couple of ways to look at conflict. And part of what we want to do always is look at ourselves first and try to understand the contributions that we're making to the results that we're getting. And that was in our first masterclass where we looked at individual responses. Today's session is really going to focus on your team's dynamic so that the team can collectively engage more effectively in conflict. And part of what I'm going to share today is how we work with leadership teams and some of the tools that we use with those leadership teams. And we're going to take a look at a case study as a starting point. And in this particular case, it's a case study of an organization that really had a lot of characteristics of a culture of nice. But before we get into the case study, let me go back to Ben and Daryl. Again, Ben being the aggressive, results-oriented leader, and Daryl really being that friendly and cooperative leader. But what we know about a team's culture and even an organizational culture is that a leader's style often plays a big role in determining that culture. And the tendencies that that leader rewards and criticizes is often what gets rewarded on a team or in an organization. And so Daryl's tendency is to avoid conflict and seek artificial harmony. Ben, on the other hand, tends to focus on fear and compliance. It's usually not his intention, but that's oftentimes the outcome. And if we look at the impact to an organization, we often will see a culture of nice or a culture of nasty. That'll be a different webinar. And some of the characteristics and behaviors that we see or are associated with a culture of nice, at its core, it's not uncommon to see passivity, where people bypass difficult conversations. And as a result, you know what happens. People nod their heads in agreement just to get through that conversation or that meeting. And then the meeting after the meeting happens because there's a strong need for harmony or validation. And we tend to get withdrawal and avoidance. And as a result, we don't get the level of commitment that we need. So all of those characteristics are what we saw with this particular organization, who unfortunately their conflict avoidance tendencies was a big factor in their downfall as an organization. And the organization didn't start out that way. It was a very successful organization. They happened to hit an industry just the right time where they built some very cool technology that really resulted in $45 million in revenues at their best, a nice size organization, 200 employees. Their culture was fun. It was laid back. People genuinely liked each other. They genuinely loved working there. And that's all good news. We don't want to lose those types of characteristics. But some of the challenges that this organization faced stemmed right from the top leadership. They embraced a lot of the culture of nice characteristics that I mentioned earlier, the avoidance, the passivity, the withdrawing, things like that. And the CEO didn't directly address issues, and avoidance and passivity were some of her strongest tendencies that really had a ripple effect across both the leadership team and others. And this organization rewarded niceness. They criticized tension, they criticized debate, and they criticized directness. And there was a huge impact of that. Unfortunately, they missed some key technological trends because people weren't willing to have the consequential conversations that were required to keep up with the market and to change and to compete with some of the newer technologies that were emerging in the marketplace. They were slow to change and not willing to address the realities of the business environment. And when we conducted confidential interviews and when we spoke with their high performers were amongst the most frustrated people in the organization. They wanted to take action. They wanted to win. But you can't win when people aren't willing to have the difficult conversations that it takes to create results in business. Eventually, this organization had to sell to private equity. Today, they're less than 75 people, and most of the products that were purchased as part of this private equity sale to private equity, they don't exist in the marketplace anymore. A culture of nice never wins. Artificial harmony is bad for business, and avoidance always results in mediocrity. And the shifts that this organization didn't make are here. They didn't make the shift to more productive conflict. They didn't make the shift to more authentic conversations. They didn't make the shift to an environment where people were coachable and feedback was core to how they operated. Oftentimes things went unsaid. There wasn't the direct, honest, and respectful conversation that was needed. And they tolerated poor performance instead of expecting exceptional performance. So don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting a culture of nasty. That's not at all what I'm suggesting, but I believe we can have both. I believe that we can have both results and relationships. And I am suggesting that we move toward a culture of candor, where dialogue is direct, dialogue is honest, and it's always respectful. And when we can make these shifts, all things become possible. And in fact, here are some of the things that we see as possible in organizations that make the shift, because not everybody will win. And you just saw that in the case study that I shared. But when these shifts are made, many things become possible. Colleagues are able to interact with each other without a fear of repercussion. They can bring up ideas. They can share different perspectives, and they can do it by giving each other a benefit of the doubt. This isn't about perfection, but it is about being able to avoid that drama and the overanalysis and the political turf war that often comes with unproductive conflict. And when organizations can do that, they can make decisions more quickly and they can pivot more quickly as the marketplace changes. All right, so that's the culture of nice. And it's obvious from my perspective, and you may have a different perspective, but it's obvious from my perspective that we don't see that as a functional place to be or a functional place to work, not just in the workplace, but in any relationship. The question becomes, how do you shift toward a culture of candor? How do we shift toward that more direct, honest, and respectful conversation? We've got a simple model based on the words candor that I'll share with you. And it incorporates some of the tools that we use with many of the leadership teams that we work with. So it starts with clarity. And by clarity, we mean a few things. One, we mean clarity of organizational values and purpose. We know that on-purpose teams and on-purpose organizations always understand what their organization stands for. They always understand their values and their cornerstones. And those values are integrated into everything they do, from hiring to developing to promoting and even firing. And they become the foundation for what's expected in conflict. But, and this is a big but, they have to be real. They have to be authentic. They can't just be pretty posters on the wall. Remember that Enron's first value was integrity. So values have to be real and they have to be authentic. And they're important and they form the foundation and the cornerstone. Values aren't enough. They're not typically specific enough, especially on teams. And so secondarily, what we believe are important are conflict norms. And so remember I told you about how I grew up in conflict. Well, I bring all of those, those passive aggressive critical tendencies into the workplace. And Other team members that I work with might have different tendencies. Maybe they grew up where being direct was very much part of the norm, or where yelling was okay, or where people were just very honest and open. We bring all of these differences into the workplace. And part of what we have to do as a team is create some norms that work with the differences that we've got in the workplace. So typically what we'll do with the team is we'll have a discussion and we'll talk about what's acceptable in conflict, what's not acceptable in conflict. And we'll always have some really interesting conversations around language and emotion and what's okay. Is it okay to swear? Is it not okay to swear? Is it okay to have a raised voice or to express passion? And part of what we do in that conversation is we'll look at a problem-solving process, because our best conflict should happen when we're trying to solve problems and make decisions. And so a typical problem-solving process really looks at four things. Number one, you start by defining the problem. Number two, you consider possibilities and brainstorm. Number three, you stop the brainstorming and you move toward analyzing options. And then number four, you consider the impact to people and all the stakeholders involved. So this overlays really nicely with DISC, the personality model that I referred to earlier. And on this team, we'll map everybody out on DISC, and then we'll talk about, what's showing up here and what are some of the norms that we need in place to compensate for the tendencies, the collective tendencies that we have as a team. So in this particular team with Steve and Michael, Jason, Patty, Steve, Glenn, Matt, and Carrie, the tendency for this team is to move toward a faster paced environment and to move toward action, results, and enthusiasm. So what happens in dialogue and debate is Jason, Steve, Patty, and Michael tend to process on the fly. We know they're doing that because they're speaking. And Carrie and Matt, they tend to like to process first before speaking. So we've got to create a conflict environment that allows for all of these styles to be successful. So some of the norms that this team put together were, let's get an agenda out 24 hours in advance. Number two, let's be prepared. And number three, if people need time in conflict to say, hey, hold on, I need more time to process this, they agree to say that and then come back within a certain amount of time with their input. Another team that we worked with, Etienne, Carl, Tony, Sean, Pat, Michael, and Rob, one of the most effective leadership teams that we've ever worked with. But look what's showing up here. There's a strong tendency toward objectivity, challenge, results, and accuracy, and not a lot of focus on the people side of the equation. So this team had to put other norms in place so that when they were making decisions and solving problems, they considered the people impact. So that's the clarity piece of the candor model. The second piece is we have to start accepting and offering feedback openly. We have to, as leaders, create an environment where your team can accept feedback, and in fact, where feedback is an expected part of the environment, because feedback becomes the foundation for any performance-based organizations. Without it, without feedback, people just simply don't evolve. So we have to be open to feedback. We have to be open to offering feedback. We have to be coachable, if you will. So how do you do that as a team member or as a leader? Especially as a leader, you have to give people permission to engage in feedback. So at the beginning of your meetings, remind people of the team norms. Let people know that you expect that they expect the team to have productive dialogue and debate and conversation within respectful bounds. I was just meeting with a client today, and they were talking about some language that they can use so that people know that they're going to have a conversation that might be important or consequential or difficult, and just labeling your meeting a radical candor meeting, an RCM meeting, but something to frame it up and to really elevate what's going to be talked about so that people accept feedback openly, giving permission for feedback, and that we're engaging in the right conversations. The third component of the model is to nurture an environment that allows people to share differences of opinions and ideas. Innovation and creativity stem from great conflict. When people are thinking the same, no one's thinking at all. So as a leader, one tool that you can use and you can put in place is to literally mine for conflict. which means pulling people into the conversation. If you've got a team of 8 people around the table and you haven't heard from everybody, literally saying, hey, Ivy, what do you think? Hey, Heidi, what do you think? Hey, Ken, what do you think? Especially as you're closing out on decisions. And I've seen countless teams where people haven't spoken up, and then toward the end of the conversation, all of a sudden there's this great idea and you realize that people actually aren't on the same page. So if you want to avoid the meeting after the meeting, you've got to engage in some mining for conflict within your meetings. The fourth component of the model is to demonstrate candor yourself by engaging in those difficult conversations, showing that you're coachable as a leader and taking action based on those conversations. So once you've had a difficult conversation, maybe you've got some action items, you better do something about it or people won't believe that you're credible. So there's a leading by example component here, meaning that if you aren't engaging in the critical conversations with candor as a leader, others won't do the same. And the fifth component of the model is to orient people to the bigger picture. And what I mean is we've got to have a clear line to vision, goals, strategy, and expectations. If people don't know where we're going, you'll have conflict that's either unfocused or focused on the wrong things. And inevitably, it becomes destructive and conflict just for conflict's sake. And that's not what we're trying to do here. So we really want our productive conflict to be oriented toward a larger goal. And then the last component of the model is to repeat everything that I just said, because people don't change behaviors, their conflict behaviors or anything else. We don't change culture with just one conversation. So as leaders and team members, we have to continually model and remind people about the expectations that you have around conflict. Keep your norms and your values visible. Remind people about the need to accept feedback openly without becoming defensive. Give people permission to engage in productive conflict. Nurture an environment that promotes a difference of opinions and ideas and minds for conflict. Demonstrate candor yourself and continually orient conversations toward that bigger picture. So here are the takeaways from today. Number one, to effectively engage in conflict, you really do have to start with yourself and understand how you're contributing to the results that you're getting. By number one, understand how your background in conflict impacts your response, your cultural background, where you grew up, your family environment, all of those things. But also think about your personality style and what are your tendencies to how you respond in conflict. Number two, recognize that a culture of nice never works. Artificial harmony never works. Avoidance never works. And we can always link those characteristics to poor business results. And number three, use the candor model to create more direct, honest, and respectful dialogue. A few resources before we wrap up. Again, this is a quick hit 30-minute masterclass. A few conflict resources for you. If you haven't gotten a copy of our conflict toolkit, you can get it on our website. I'll also send you a follow-up email after our session today. This is an 11-page document. It provides some of the tips and tools that we discussed today and in our last masterclass. And along with that, there's some reflection questions to get you and your team to think about how to create a more productive conflict environment and less artificial harmony in the workplace. This masterclass will be uploaded to the same webpage. That may take us a few days. And the other masterclass that we recorded this summer is already up there. So if you want a few quick tips around nurture and nature and how that impacts your responses in conflict, you can check that out. And then finally, I want to let you know that we also offer a productive conflict workshop if you and your team want a more guided and impactful approach to conflict. And it's all part of our on-purpose leadership philosophy, where we're trying to create healthier workplaces by helping individuals and leaders make meaningful and measurable change. So this workshop itself, it's a 4-hour workshop. It explores your conflict style using the new Everything Disc Productive Conflict Profile. It's a really powerful profile. You'll learn how to recognize your derailing productive behaviors. You'll learn about how your thoughts and your assumptions and beliefs are connected to either productive or destructive outcomes. So again, it's about productive conflict and not conflict resolution. And then when we pair it with Coach Metrics, we can start to measure behavioral change and cultural change to ensure new productive conflict behaviors stick in your organization. If you book a workshop with us by the end of the year, and it could be for next year, scheduled for next year, we're going to throw in a free 50-minute productive conflict coaching sessions that will help you accelerate those conflict behavior changes. So I'll send out a follow-up email about all of those resources, and you can always contact us at info@512solutions.com. Thanks everyone for joining us for this Productive Conflict Beyond a Culture of Nice Masterclass. It's part of our On Purpose Masterclass series, where we're trying to create healthier leaders, healthier workplaces, one person at a time. Look forward to staying in touch and hearing more about your success. Thanks, and have a great weekend.